like I do in class.
Welcome to tonight's Adams State College faculty lecture. Tonight it is a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker. He's a friend of mine from a couple of years ago. We went through CELT together, Dr. Mark Finney. Dr. Finney is an assistant professor of mass communications here at Adams State College. He's also the faculty advisor to the school newspaper, the South Colorado. For those of you who live in this area, this may be going back in time because I believe he's going to take us back to those wonderful days of the salmonella poisoning episode and talk about how newspapers cover those sorts of events, community crises in small towns. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Finney.
Thank you. Well, it was really just a year ago, or a year and a half ago. Although it feels like it's been longer for me at least. Okay, so voluntarily, of course, how many of you think or know you got salmonella during the outbreak? Anybody?
My son did.
Your son did? Okay. Know somebody who got salmonella? A bunch more? Does anyone want to... Okay, so how did you first hear about this? I mean, it's not JFK, of course, and it's not the Challenger explosion, but where were you when you first heard about, the salmonella crisis? Anybody want to volunteer? Yeah, Sarah.
I was home on my lunch break, and I was watching 9 News out of Denver, and they did a story. And Lucy was in Colorado Springs.
No, I was in Cole Park.
In Cole Park, right.
And
So I
she
texted her, and I said, there's salmonella in Salamosa. And I said it just like that in a text.
Yeah. With emoticons.
Yes.
Right. Anybody else? Yes.
The people that bought my house 2 years ago, their baby was the first known case.
Oh.
And I think, oh my goodness,
Were they the ones who sued the city?
I have no idea.
You don't know. There was somebody sued the city over it. You're nodding your head as in that was a person, or you're just saying? Oh, you know the person that did. Okay.
I know the name.
Yeah, one person sued the city, and my understanding of it, and I haven't spoken with this person, but the reason why they sued was because they couldn't collect from their insurance unless they sued, or for some, I don't know. Anyways, I first learned of the crisis. Okay, so I was moving from an apartment into a house, and my friend Scott Holman was helping me, and we were taking a break, and we were sitting on the porch of the house drinking tap water when we were listening to KRZA, and I was shocked both by I'll tell you what they said. The announcer, and I don't know who it was, says there's a rumor in town that the city water is contaminated with salmonella. This is just a rumor. It's not confirmed. Keep doing what you're doing, essentially, as we're tipping up glasses of tap water, going, really? Okay, so this is an academic paper that I wrote. What I'm doing basically today is presenting this research that I did and having a discussion with you guys about it. It's an academic paper in which I am attempting to compare... Left button?
Same as normal mouse.
Okay. Compare relevant mass communication theory with the coverage of the salmonella crisis in the Valley Courier here in town. I want to have a bit of a little disclaimer, or not a disclaimer, but a preface. Some of the data that comes out of this research is critical of the Valley Courier's coverage. And the Valley Courier won 2 awards for their coverage of the salmonella crisis. And I want to acknowledge that, and that is really important and it's really significant. That some of this data is critical is not necessarily a reflection on the Valley Courier. It is rather a comparison with this theory. And that's really what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to develop sort of our knowledge about local newspapers, about our coverage of community crises. And so I hope we take this, or I hope y'all take that this whole thing, with that in mind. I'm not trying to slam on the Valley Courier in any sort of way. I'm going to skip I was going to do a little overview of the presentation, but I'm just going to go ahead and skip that. There were 140 stories total written about the salmonella crisis. 49 of those were written by the Valley Courier. This story was ignored by the papers of record in the United States. The New York Times didn't pick it up. The Washington Post didn't pick it up. The LA Times didn't pick it up. NPR ran, I think, 3 stories on it. NBC, CBS, and ABC each ran 1 story on it. Fox did not, which is not a reflection on Fox. The Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News wrote 24 stories on it together. So my point in telling you all this is that the Valley Courier was really the leader in the coverage of this crisis. They outpaced any other news source by almost 2 to 1. And that's why I decided to use the Valley Courier as the object of this research. Well, that's one of the reasons why.
So I heard that it was actually covered in Europe.
Oh, I only looked at U.S. papers. I didn't actually go outside of the country. So it's possible. But you know, Robert brings up a really good point, which is that if you have a question, go ahead and shout it out. I'm not here to, talk at you for the next 45 minutes or so. So if you have a question, go ahead. But then I will have some time afterwards to have like a discussion about it. So if you want to wait, that's cool too. Notes is good. So the Valley Courier is the major object of this research. This is a crisis that was environmental or industrial in nature. It's a little bit hard to describe. On one hand, salmonella is an environmental issue. The contamination of a city water system is also sort of an industrial issue. And some of the scholarship, which I'll talk about in a little bit, feels like you need to distinguish between industrial and environmental crises when you're doing an analysis of how they're covered in the news. And I'll talk about why in a bit. This clearly had significant impact on the community. I mean, the whole zip code was affected. Zip code, area codes for phones. Zip code was affected. And we also have a small town daily newspaper. The Valley Courier is read in more houses in the valley than any other source by quite a lot. So we have a major news source, or a major minor news source, a minor news source who's major in the community rather, covering a crisis that has a significant community impact that is both industrial and environmental in nature, depending on how you want to look at it. The research questions that I asked had to do with who were the sources for the Courier's coverage. Who were the people that they used to quote? What was their relationship to the crisis? What was their knowledge base with regards to salmonella, with the science of infection, etc.? And also, what explanations were offered by sources with regards to what was going on, what had happened, what would happen, etc.? I was also interested in the timing of the coverage. Some of the scholarship suggests that crises such as this can be broken up into distinct periods, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So I was looking at both the crisis as a long-term project, which was about a month, but also broken up into different stages, and how the coverage was the same or was different on the basis of those stages. And then I was also looking at the coverage of responsibility for both the crisis happening, its long-term effects, and what was going on in the moment to repair what had happened. The way I did this was via a content analysis. Am I right? Am I on the right slide? I think so. Okay, so mass communication scholarship looks at the relationship between media and culture. This means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. If you ask Dr. Bonstetter, who's also a mass comm professor here, she'll probably give you a slightly different answer. But to me, that means looking at news. Looking at the way that news presents information to us, and then looking at the way that we, as a society, deal with that information. My primary area of research has to do with international conflict and war. My dissertation is on the period before we went to war in Iraq, looking at the coverage of the conflict and how that contributed to our eventually going to war. But in a nutshell, what we're doing here is looking at the way that news is constructed, the way that news is presented, and then how that presentation of news influences us as a community and how we deal with things. One of the ways that we do this is by doing a content analysis, and that basically means that we look at a huge number of stories or articles related to whatever it is that you're talking about, and we quantify things. We create variables that we can count, and we can look at favorability, or we can look at how many times this thing is emphasized or this object is used. And on that basis, we can talk about what the content was saying, what emphases it was giving us, etc. So what I was looking at, how many times particular sources, for instance, were used in the coverage and what they said. And also what explanations were offered for what happened in the crisis, for how it happened, and when and which people were saying these things, what sort of interest they may have had in saying those things. And what I found is that there were 3 types of stories that turned up the most in the coverage. I am on the right page. 1, commerce affected. There were a lot of stories in the coverage that talked about the local businesses, the fact that many of our businesses were losing business because people weren't going out, especially the restaurants. You know, nobody was eating at restaurants during the period because they were afraid of what was going on. And so our commerce was dramatically affected. Most of the stories, or many of the stories, dealt with this issue. Local government activity. As you know, the way that we resolved this problem was by flushing the city water system with enormous amounts of chlorine, and there were a lot of stories about the flush. What stage of the flush we're in, what the flush is doing, how we can prepare, what we should and shouldn't be doing during that time. And then the third is representation of victims, going out and talking to people in the community who have been affected, how they've been affected, and a lot of stories having to do with what people should be doing during this period. You know, so it's flush stage 1, you don't want to be taking a shower right now. Flush stage 2, you can take a shower, but you can't wash your veggies, etc. The 2 least prevalent issues that were covered by the Valley Courier were the long-term effects, and by long-term effects I mean both before the crisis happened, leading up to it. There wasn't much discussion about the preceding period, but also there wasn't much discussion about what happens after this is over, how we're going to deal with the water. I mean, they did talk about what the water system is going to look like afterwards, but in not very many stories. And there wasn't much discussion about what we ought to be doing after the crisis. And then the other issue was the cause of the contamination. Yeah?
How did you determine the least prevalent issues?
It's a simple matter of counting. I saw those things showing up less frequently in the coverage than these other issues. These were really just issues of counting.
But how did you determine them to be categories to count? I mean, couldn't there be a category that didn't have any representation in it that you don't have any 0 counts for?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So the way that you come up with the content. Okay. So when you're doing a content analysis, you pull out a sample of stories and you read through them and you create categories that you see there. You know, it's sort of a small sample, and you just pull out categories that you think exist in these things, and then you just look for instances of them in the remainder of the coverage. And when you come across something else, because this was my number here was 49. There were only 49 stories that I was using here. So the statistical viability of my research was pretty low. You can't do very many high-level statistical analyses with just 49 data points. So by comparison, my dissertation had 500 stories. So in that kind of a situation, so I went by and I started counting, and I said, okay, we see this issue, I'm going to make a category for that. I see this issue, I'm going to make a category for that. And I just went through and did that several times. I made a category for mentions of school, school closings, what schools are doing, and I found that to be an issue that wasn't represented hardly at all. There were like 2 or 3 stories that dealt with that. But I did try to count every major issue that I could see. Okay? Does that answer? Not really?
How come school closings isn't a least prevalent issue?
Oh, well, you're right. Okay. The major stories, the major ones, the ones that got more than like 10%. Okay? Let's see. Most of the sources in the Courier's coverage were local government officials. especially Mayor Burvig and Public Works Director Kosklin. Is that how you say that? Okay. Those were the two sources who were used most frequently in the Courier's coverage. Fewer than a third of the sources were external experts, city workers, scientists, Colorado or federal emergency management officials. And I'll come back to that in terms of its importance. Many of the stories that did have scientists in them were what we might call soft news. So for instance, there was a story about the two scientists who worked at the Sierra Blanca lab who discovered that something's going on, that more than they expected more instances of salmonella infection were coming up in their tests than they usually see. And so these two alert scientists were the ones that initially discovered that something's going on here. And there was a story about them. There were other stories about scientists doing their work, but the scientists weren't used significantly to talk about the crisis. They were rather used to talk about themselves. Does that make sense? We had stories about scientists, but we didn't have scientists talking about salmonella. I think that says it a little better. Along these same lines, a significant portion of the stories about the crisis were positive. There were lots of stories about how effectively the city government was dealing with the crisis, how well the city manager was doing in alerting people and handing out the leaflets that told us what stage of the flush we were in, etc. There were a lot of stories like that. And conversely, there were few negative stories. And that, I think, has a relationship to there not being very many stories about how the contamination happened, or why the contamination happened, or who might be responsible for the contamination happening. Let's see. Let's see. Related to this, one of the challenges that I had in doing this research is that I didn't really talk to anybody at the Valley Courier. So I don't know how they practiced or how they went out, who they talked to, what kinds of things that they did. All that I know is what was in the content of the papers. And on one hand, this is really useful because what I know, or sorry, I touched the mic. What I saw was what everybody was seeing. I didn't have any insider information that might change the way that I observed this coverage. But on the other hand, it means that there were things that I may have missed out on. So one of my findings is that there wasn't a whole lot of investigation about, let's see, verifying the things that Mayor Burvig said, verifying the things that Don Kosklin said, checking into the evidence, etc. It looked from the coverage like, you know, when the mayor said something, it was printed, and that was the end of it. Did I put that up there? Here we are. The best explanation, or really the only explanation that was offered as to what caused the contamination, was Mayor Burvig's assertion that we may never know the source of the contamination. The argument that he made was that once they started flushing the system, there was no way to determine where the contamination came from. And so this assertion was repeated several times throughout the coverage in the Courier. And it was not corroborated, it was not investigated. There was never a scientist or somebody else who said, yes, that's true, or no, that's not true, etc. There was one instance, however, where the Courier did uncover something that went beyond, I think, what Mayor Burvig was saying. This fella, Ron Falco, who worked for the Colorado Health Department, was doing an investigation alongside with the salmonella research. And he just, let me take a step back. They speculated that there were three ways that the water system was contaminated. One was that there were cracks in the underground pipes. Two was that there were cracks in the above ground reservoirs. Three is that there was this thing called cross-contamination, which is that sewer water was somehow being mixed with clean water and then getting back into the system. So this guy, Ron Falco, who worked for the health department, came down here and says that they came across 7 businesses with backflow problems that the public works director labeled as urgent, another 57 that were medium hazard, and 22 that were low priority. What this means, in a sense, okay, so the state mandates that a business that cooks has to have these backflow valves I'm not an engineer, I don't, these backflow valves in their sewer or their waste systems, and that these prevent the dirty water from getting mixed into the clean water. And what he found is that in 7 of these instances, these were either absent or so severely impaired as to be labeled urgent. And another 57 were medium hazard and 22 that were low priority. When I saw that, my journalistic radar went way up. And I said to myself, oh, they have to follow up on this story. There has to be somebody that they can talk to that can tell them, is this the cause of the contamination? It seems like at least a plausible explanation. But this was the only story where this was mentioned. Let's talk a bit about mass comm theory. We've been studying news practices for nearly a century. Way back in the beginning of the 20th century, many people believed that news content reflected reality. Something happens in the world, it gets covered with the camera, well, I guess not with a camera that far back, but it gets covered in the news, and that news report that you see is a reflection of what was going on, an exact replica almost of what was going on. Well, it took us about 50 years to come to terms with the idea that that's not exactly correct. Actually, news content represents reality. It emphasizes certain things, it de-emphasizes other things. A lot of this has to do with the way that we practice journalism in terms of when we look for exciting stories or when we talk to particular people. The conventions of news affect the way that news content comes out. There we go. News values such as truth or objectivity, verification, and independence are the ideals that journalists tend to subscribe to. They try, whenever possible, to adhere to these things, to present stories objectively, to verify information that they get, that they are independent from entities that they're covering, and that they are free to do what they want. I mean, it's all about the First Amendment to a certain extent, President Obama doesn't buy journalists. If he did, that would be a real mistake. In fact, I heard a story the other day that the LA Hawks, is that the hockey team? They bought the sports writer from the LA Times, and now he's writing for them. Getting paid to write about the Hawks, not the Hawks, whatever. For their website, the hockey team. So the hockey team now employs its own journalist. The Kings, thank you, yeah. Well, that's not journalism. That's public relations, right? Journalists are independent, they're free. These are the ideals that they subscribe to. But the fact is that journalists also have to, or news organizations also have to make a profit, which means that their stories must be interesting and that they must be entertaining. People need to read them. And so the news values get a little tweaked sometimes in order to fulfill this other obligation of, being entertaining and making money. And the argument is, and this has been demonstrated over and over again, that these tweaks, these side steps that journalists do have an effect. When you cover a story from a particular point of view, the audience tends to identify with that particular point of view. If you look at conflict coverage, it's all over the place. Most of the time when we talk about international conflict, we talk about it from the perspective of the United States. I don't want to go off on a tangent, sorry. So what we do as mass communication scholars is study, or what some of us do, it's not what all of us do, but what some of us do is study the practice by which news is created. And we try then to look at the content and then look at the effects of that content as sort of a loop in the relationship between culture and mass communication. And there are a couple of themes that I want to bring out right now. One is this idea of the, I already covered that stuff, beats. Journalists work in beats. News organizations work in beats. And this means that they have a journalist who his whole job or her whole job is to go and talk to the police and cover the police. And when the police do something, that's what they cover. That's their whole job. That's their whole life. Somebody else covers City Hall. Somebody else covers, education, etc. These are beats. What happens when you cover things as beats, though, is that okay, let's pretend that there's a robbery and a police officer arrests a suspect. And the journalist, because they're the police beat reporter, goes and talks to that police officer and says, "What can you tell me?" Well, the police officer gives them the whole pile of information, and the journalist then goes and writes that up. Well, while it may not be incorrect, what you're looking at then is the police officer's perspective on what's happened, or the law's perspective on what's happened. And the same works with any sort of a beat. You tend to get the perspective of the people that you're interviewing. The other idea is this of the news net. So imagine that a journalist or a news organization is a fisherman, and they've got a big net and they're trying to catch tuna. Tuna's a big fish, right? So they take their net and they throw it in the water, and because they're catching big fish, they've got big holes in their net, and they scoop it up and they get a dozen tuna, but there are a lot of other fish and other things that slip through the net. And so when you use beats, or when you're an efficient news organization, you also miss stories. You also miss perspectives. And that's another key point that we've found about the coverage of news, generally. Did I get that whole thing? Most mainstream news organizations do use beats. Most of them inadvertently use the news net as well.
So, question.
Yeah.
Does that mean that they might hear about a smaller story but intentionally decide it's not worth covering?
No, what's more likely is that they don't hear about it, or that they unintentionally ignore it, or they feel like they've dealt with it with another story that comes from from one of their beat sources, etc. It's sort of like little kids soccer. Everybody's heard of bunch ball, right? Where somebody kicks the ball and then like the whole team, both teams go boom, swarming over towards the ball, and they're all kicking it around in a little circle, and the coach is on the corner or on the sideline going, spread out, defense, whatever. Journalism is a lot like bunch ball. Something happens, the ball gets kicked, and then the whole industry swarms to it. But there's the whole rest of this field that's not being utilized. Yeah.
So how much do those factors play a role with the Valley Courier being like a smaller size, and so they would have smaller holes in their nets possibly?
Well.
And how does that affect this coverage?
Can you wait 2 slides?
Okay.
Okay. Because I will get to that.
Okay.
I just want to deal with one other thing or 2 other things before we get there. So a secondary issue. So we've got the broad sort of news or news practices issue. We've also got this issue of the fact that this is an extraordinary event. Day-to-day news operations work great with beats, because when you use a beat or when you use the news net, most of the time you're going to hit the important stories. But when an extraordinary event like the salmonella crisis happens, all of a sudden things get a little bit confused, because your regular sources may not be totally appropriate. Furthermore, your job as a news organization changes. Doris Graber, who wrote in 1972 that there are 3 stages to crisis coverage. In the first stage, the news organization's job is to inform the public about what's going on and tell them quickly and efficiently what they can do to be safe. In the second stage, their job is to continue to inform the public and continue to tell them what they can do to be safe, but also to add context to the story, to broaden the scope of the story. I was going to do a whole section today on Hurricane Katrina, because there's a lot of research related to the coverage of Hurricane Katrina and how that applies here, but there just isn't time for it. I have this really good book, though, that CNN put together, and it's the stories that the journalists wrote themselves about covering the conflict. If anyone's interested in seeing this afterwards, that's cool. I'm not going to pass it around yet. Okay. Karen wants me to pass it around. And then in the third stage, we've got this whole aftermath thing going on. You know, what's going on still, what people can do still to be safe, but how we can deal with things after the fact, what the rest of the world is going to, what the world is going to look like to us after this whole thing is over. And what she argues is that in these different stages, the types of people that you use as sources need to be different. In the first stage, you can definitely use your usual sources, your mayors, your city public works people, etc., because these people are familiar, they're calming to the community. I mean, part of the job is that you don't want to make everybody freak out and panic, right? But at the same time, you need to be providing them with information. And the fact is, mayors tend to be generalists. They're not experts generally on, you know, salmonella, for instance, on water contamination, for instance. And even the public works director, who's an engineer, I believe, is not an expert in salmonella contamination generally. But so as you move on, as you add context, as you add depth in your stories, in the second stage, you need to expand, or a news organization needs to expand its source list to include more scientists, more experts, more people that can give more accurate information. Because the other issue is that in the first stage of a crisis, and the Katrina hurricane is a great example of this, a lot of misinformation goes out because journalists strive to get things done quickly, especially at the beginning of a crisis. In the third stage, your regular or your usual sources come back into play more as, you know, they begin to learn more about what's going on, but also in terms of that soothing, calming voice of regularity, etc., coming back out and helping us figure out what to do in the aftermath. News organizations really struggle with these situations. They often have to deal with technological or infrastructural problems like they did in Hurricane Katrina. But the other issue, and this is a really important one, is who do you trust as a source in those cases? You know, at what point does a news organization decide, okay, this guy who's our usual go-to guy on water stuff doesn't know as much about salmonella as this other fellow who nobody's ever heard of because he came from Denver, for instance. And at which point can you bring that guy back into the coverage as a calming voice, etc. It's a really gray area. It's a real challenge for a news organization. It tests them. Let's see. I'm like going more slowly than I thought I was going to. And then a third wrinkle, sorry, 3 slides. A third wrinkle is that major newspapers are struggling, right? Denver Post is struggling, Rocky Mountain News is gone, the Chicago Trib may be gone soon. All these news organizations, not all these, many big news organizations claim at least to be suffering. The fact is most of them are still profitable. But they're making a lot less than they did before. And those that have been bought by large conglomerate news organizations are suffering the most because they have less of a margin for error. There's less of an opportunity when you're owned by a giant corporation to be unprofitable before you get chucked. And that's sort of what happened with the Rocky Mountain News. But the consequence of this, or a consequence of this, is that local newspapers are really picking up the slack. They are getting some of these journalists that are being laid off by the major news organizations. They are covering stories in more depth than the majors are able to do anymore. And they're also getting a lot more readership. I mean, I used to be a Rocky Mountain News subscriber, and when the Rocky went away, what am I going to do? There's the Pueblo Chieftain, which still gets delivered. There's the Valley Courier that still gets delivered. Or I could do, you know, the Denver Post online, which I'm not going to do, because I can look at their website and get all that information for free. So local newspapers are actually doing really well in this environment. Many of them are. Not all of them, of course. But many local news organizations are doing really well in this environment. They're getting more readers. They're getting more advertising dollars. They're expanding their staffs, etc. What this means, conceptually though, is that we as scholars have to shift in our thinking about news. We can't just do a study on the Washington Post or the Denver Post even and expect that it's somehow going to be representative or even that it's going to be widely read anymore. we have to look a lot more at local newspapers. It means that our analyses of local newspapers become much more important because that's where people are turning, or some people are turning, to get their news content, which is why this is a relevant research project. Now I'll get to your issue. E.L. Quarantelli, 1978, wrote a research paper called The Command Post Point of View. In this article, he argues that local journalists are, especially constrained. In a national news setting, if you work for the Denver Post, you show up to talk to the mayor and you say, I'm from the Denver Post, and you ask hard questions, and because you're from the Denver Post, which is a big news organization, they answer your questions. You can ask hard questions, you can ask easy questions, whatever, but they have a real incentive in asking them because, you know, if you write, this guy said nothing to me, that's sort of newsworthy in and of itself. Local newspapers struggle more with this for a couple of reasons. One is that in a community of, we're what, 11,000 people in Alamosa? 8,000 people in Alamosa? You know everybody. Which means not only do you have professional relationships with the people that you're covering, and a lot of times you have personal relationships with them as well. And what this creates, according to Quarantelli, is a disincentive for you to question these sources unless you have a real reason for doing so, unless there's real evidence to suggest that you should be doing so. And the result of this is that news content tends to present particular perspectives in its coverage. The first of these is that you get way more of the local elite's perspective than you do in other news sources. But more importantly is that news favors explanations that find responsibility in individuals, not institutions. And also, they tend to think of things, and I guess I didn't write this on the slide, they tend to present things in terms of short-term answers. You know, there's a water contamination, we're doing the flush, in 3 weeks things are going to be fine. Right? That's sort of a basic law and order kind of a perspective. And what Quarantelli argues is that in situations like this with local journalism, you're more likely to see that short-term law and order perspective. So that sort of answers your question, I think, right? That the relationship between the journalists and the people that they're covering is much closer. And it makes it harder for them, according to Quarantelli, to question these sources, to investigate what they're saying, unless they have a real reason for doing so. So in some ways, we can see that the coverage in the Courier reflected the theoretical insight that I've tried to offer here. You know, we had the usual sources most of the time in the coverage. Mayor Burvig and other local elites were allowed to present their perspectives without much questioning. Nobody asked, at least in the coverage, you know, is that really the case? That we may never know the answer because the flush eliminates the opportunity to do that? There was no investigation about whether these 7 local businesses with urgent backflow problems could have caused this. We don't even know what those 7 businesses were, what their names were. That may be important to readers. It may be important to determining how this happened and maybe even presenting it and maybe even preventing it, in the future. Let's see. The Courier didn't follow up on lead. There was no blame or responsibility levied against anybody or any organization in the Courier's coverage. That's another thing that put my journalist radar up. Because one of the things that journalists, just put on your TV news, check out a major paper. One of the things that journalists always do is blame somebody, right? Even with Hurricane Katrina, which was clearly an environmental catastrophe, everybody was blamed for that. The Corps of Engineers dug the levees too small and too brittly. FEMA did a cruddy job doing so-and-so, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Blame is almost always available in an event. And journalists have they always try to figure out, or almost always try to figure out, who's to blame? Who can we point to in this thing? But they didn't do that in the Courier, which is one way that the Courier really deviated from the theory about journalism, or about local journalism. On the other hand, it also does conform sort of to what Quarantelli tells us about their disinclination to question sources that they have relationships with. And along the same lines, you know, if you turn on your news, you're going to see, like, you know, 11 negative stories and maybe one positive one about a puppy being rescued from a tree or something, or cat being rescued from a tree or something. But the exact opposite existed in the Courier. Most of the stories were positive, and only a couple of them were negative. Okay. So the data suggests that Quarantelli's command post point of view rings true in a lot of ways in the coverage here. There appeared at least to be a close relationship between the media organization and the local elites, in that there wasn't much questioning. And of course, I should again say, we don't know, or I don't know, what the reporters were actually finding. You know, I don't know who they actually spoke to. I only know what was reported in the news. We saw the law and order perspective in terms of the short-term area in which we talked about this crisis. You know, this is happening, it's going to be over soon, and then that's the end of it. I mean, after the month and a half in which this was really happening, the story dropped off. There weren't many stories about it after that. In the national media, I mean, it totally went away until March of the following year, when there was red water coming from some of people's taps. And so between like the middle of April in 2008, or I guess the end of April 2008, and the middle of March 2009, there was nothing in the national news about Salamosa and salmonella. And we also saw explanations that looked a lot more towards successes than at responsibility. And that goes along with Quarantelli as well. The fog of war, I'm going on a tangent for a second, is this idea that journalists covering war zones are affected by what's going on around them, and their content is affected by that as well. And there are two major factors. The first is that journalists tend to be loyal to their country, right? And so their loyalty affects their coverage. The second thing is that, you know, a journalist in a war zone has a very limited perspective. They don't necessarily have internet access. They don't know what's going on. You know, if we're in the desert in Iraq, we don't know what's going on in Baghdad. You don't know what's going on in Washington, etc. You report what's around you, and you report it positively because, well, if no other reason, because the guys that you're covering are, you know, covering your butt, right? And there may be a relationship between Quarantelli's command post point of view and this idea of the fog of war. And it has to do with the relationship between the sources and the journalists. This tie between sources and journalists in the fog of war situation definitely influences the way that the journalists cover the story. The question is that also what we're seeing in the coverage of local crises? Of course, you know, these are very different scenarios. You know, journalists covering salmonella aren't getting shot at, or dealing with sandstorms, or, you know, any of that other stuff. So there are clearly distinctions between them two. But there is the question, or there at least is the similarity between these two coverages, and it's worth looking in the future at if and how this relationship exists. And I just want to reiterate that what we're talking about here is a world in which local newspapers are rising in prominence. And so it is worth examining conceptually and practically what's going on in that news organization, in that news operation. Because this is the news that many of us are going to be seeing for the next foreseeable future, you know, as the New York Times shrinks. I mean, do you know how much a New York Times subscription costs in Alamosa? It's like $600 a year. Who the heck can afford that? So, that's sort of what we're doing here, is looking at local news comparing it with the theory related to local news, and the next steps are to do it in other instances, to look at other papers in small communities that are dealing with crises, etc. And I think that's all I've got. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions if anyone has any for our speaker.
I have to hold it down. Yeah.
Was there any, was your research strictly done in the print?
Yes.
Thing?
Yeah.
So the online component was a significant component because obviously it was a disaster where like people couldn't access computers, right? And a lot of people were getting information off of websites via news feeds and
Right. It's there are inherent limitations in doing this kind of research. I wanted to also study KRZA, but there's no record of what KRZA does or says. It's not recorded or anything. The reason why I selected the Courier, selected print, is because I had no way of knowing what other resources people were using, what websites they were going to, etc. What I did know, though, is that the Courier is delivered to something like 5,000 homes in the area, and that the next biggest newspaper was the Denver Post, and that was only delivered to something like 600 homes. And so I took that as the largest news source available and sort of presumed that it would be representative. Plus the fact that these other news organizations weren't picking the story up, so that's why I selected the Courier. Did that answer your question?
Well, I guess it probably is, the web component is probably understated in the research because
You mean,
there's so much more reach with that.
you mean the Courier's website?
Any website that the news that is covering the story in the news component, right?
Right.
So I know the college put in
Right.
a feed from the Courier and a feed. They were probably producing their own news
Right.
at the time.
The college had a website up. They were producing their own information as well.
So Mark, how do mass communication researchers research a media that isn't recordable and you can go back and look at things like radio or media?
It's a real challenge. The easiest way, although it's not easy at all, is to record it in real time. Or to go and talk to audiences after the fact and say, which sources did you go to, and then go back and review those sources, on their own.
It's not like text searchable or anything that would be...
Well, what I did is a LexisNexis search. So, I scoured the news community.
What you're describing sounds like sociological and, individual interviews and really labor intensive.
Well, and the other component is that, just because something is printed or just because an audience reads it doesn't mean that's what they believe necessarily, right? I mean, there's no hard and fast rule with regards to the effectiveness of news content on an audience. And so, so that's not really the issue, I guess. You want, of course, to try to get something that's representative or to try to get something that's widely read, but to then, you'll notice I didn't talk much about the audience or the effects of this coverage on the audience. And the reason why is because I don't have any basis for making that kind of an argument. And that's something that mass communication really struggles with. Furthermore, I'm not going to go on that tangent either. In terms, sorry, I will, just for a second. If we want to talk about, violence in media, right? A lot of the early research on violence in media put kids in front of violent content and then put them in front of a punching bag and tried to determine on the basis whether or not they were more or less violent after watching that violent content. And the fact is that's a totally inappropriate way to do it because most of these kids have seen TV before, have been exposed to violence on TV before. And so there's no basis for this, what's the word, this isolated test, right? And then the same goes with media content, with any media content. So that's a struggle. Yes, Dave.
You said that most of the coverage was devoted to the effects on commerce.
Right.
What was the nature of it? Was it to inform people that these businesses were struggling? Did it look like the businesses were making a complaint about
No.
survival? Or
It was, gosh. I mean, it wasn't an it. There was lots of variability to the coverage. A lot of it talked about how, City Market and Safeway were out of water, or how, what's that? The Mexican restaurant at 6th and 285 there, just east of, huh? Not your, no, not Mom. What is Mrs. Rivera's? Yeah, they covered Mrs. Rivera's, for instance, who it was like a Friday night and there's nobody in there. So there was a lot of different variability. A lot of it had to do with, there was a story on a dry cleaner. People weren't sending their clothes to the dry cleaning because they thought their clothes would be contaminated with salmonella afterwards, even though dry cleaning is not a water cleaning system. So there was a wide variety of stories on the commerce, and most of it had to do, it was actually it was a challenge for me to distinguish between the category that I created of discussion of victims and discussion of businesses, because there was so much overlap in the two, because so many of the stories about businesses were about how they're suffering economically as a result of it.
Did you look at the advertisers for the paper, or in the paper, and compare those to what their articles were about?
No. Did not look at advertising.
An avenue worth investigating?
It may be. My sense, though, is that most advertisers in newspapers have long-term contracts, and so on a day-to-day basis, it wouldn't change all that much unless people started pulling their ads. Although I could see a space for, we have clean water, or, the water's contaminated, drink the beer, which was a slogan, Mm-hmm.
Did you look at the letters to the editor?
No. Well, no, I didn't. I did not. And the reason why is because I'm concerned with the practice of journalism, with news practices. And letters to the editor, while an editor makes a decision about whether or not to include letters to the editor, they aren't written by journalists. They don't go through the same sort of practical or ethical considerations that journalists do when they write a story.
So how do you feel about the twittering on CNN?
We could have a whole nother lecture on TV news these days, on the 24-hour news thing, because that's really interesting right now. But that's for another night. Yeah?
I'm curious, your conclusion, pretty much that Cortinelli principle holds. If the next crisis comes in, what can we really believe out of the Courier, because they're afraid to investigate certain things in depth, like scientist Falco's comment about things. And the publisher of the Courier is very pro-business, hangs around with a lot of these people, and I just wonder, you might have a hotshot reporter, but he might be getting overruled by somebody higher up, and we as the public are not getting the complete story at all.
Right.
On salmonella or a lot of other things in our local newspaper, and
Yeah.
we don't really have an
Well,
alternative.
Send him to the South Coloradan. We'll give him plenty of space. No, one of the things, I guess the inspiration for this research for me was that, it's a year and a half later and we still don't have any idea how the contamination happened. And I am shocked by this.
There's apparently lawsuits in progress, but you don't read anything about what's going on with those.
Right, yeah. I'm sorry, what did you say? So what do we do? We as the public, we could write to the Courier and tell them, what we think. But I was shocked by the fact that we still don't know what caused this contamination. And while I appreciate that the mayor probably isn't lying to us, the assertion that we may never know just seems so...
It could happen again.
It just doesn't seem plausible to me.
Someone does know, but it would be a relationship.
Right. Well, that's a possibility.
Ending businesses.
I think what's more likely is that, well, gosh, I shouldn't. I'm not going to say this is likely. What I think is probably happened is probably when they did start doing the flush, they eliminated our opportunity to tell what's going on, because the chlorine in the water eliminates the salmonella bacteria. But there was a period before that happened, and the skeptic in me wonders how quickly they went to the flush in order that they could obscure how it happened. and I use they, which I hate when my students do, so I'm sorry about that. And I don't know that that's the case. And in fact, I'm sure that our local government isn't devious enough or to do anything like that. That's not what I'm trying to suggest. It's just that there are so many questions out there.
Social forces that would, there are disincentives to funding the.
Well, exactly. There are real disincentives, and the sources that were used in the coverage had a real interest in promoting particular perspectives. If, for instance, we could find that there was a source and that it was related to the local government in some way, the local government would have a real interest in not having that information out there. And this is all rhetorical, of course, or academic, as the news orgs like to say. We as journalists, there's a responsibility to take sources with a grain of salt. When a mayor tells you we may never know, a skeptical journalist is going to say, yeah, that's what you say. Let me go talk to the scientist over here or talk to this other source over here who may or may not give me another perspective. And in addition to that, they're going to print that information. They're going to say, Mayor Burvik says we may never know, and Ron Falco agrees, But we didn't get that kind of corroboration in our coverage, which is why we can speculate now. We didn't have answers to those questions. There's also, one of the things that I left out about this Quarantelli thing is that there is a cultural distinction between local and national level journalists. The news values tend to be applied more stringently at the national level or even at the regional level than they do at the local level. So if the Washington Post or the New York Times or whatever had come to town, it's quite likely that they would have gone to a second source or a third source to corroborate or to refute that kind of an assertion. But because local journalists aren't always professionally trained, because local journalists have these relationships that Quarantelli tells us about, because the pressure is a little less tense, there is less of a stringent application of the news values that would compel a journalist to go on and to keep looking into that.
But sorry to just keep talking.
That's okay.
But you said you had seen it on 9 News or like
Right.
one of the regional news organizations. Is it because they weren't physically here, or how come they didn't pursue using these?
Well, there appears to be a threshold for larger news organizations to consider something to be newsworthy. In an environmental crisis like this or an industrial crisis like this, it appears as though you need a larger population that's affected. You need to have a couple of people die before a major news organization really gets interested in it. I mean, they may cover it, but in order for them to really get interested in it, it needs to be more dramatic or bigger than it appears this crisis was. Did you?
Well, I was just thinking about the balloon story. That didn't seem to affect a whole lot of people.
No, but it was dramatic. It was interesting. There was a child, who was involved in a potentially perilous situation. That's news fodder. They love that kind of story. But a community of 8,000, getting the stomach bug for several weeks, which, and granted, it was bigger than that. For us, we were living. I mean, it was terrifying. It was threatening, and it could have been a lot worse than it really was. But that's not big news to the Denver Post. It's not big news to the New York Times or to something like that. And one of the questions that I ask in my paper, and I actually have half a dozen copies of the paper if anybody wants to take one home. One of the questions that I ask towards the end is, what is this threshold wherein a large news organization is going to pick up the story? And I don't just mean cover it once. I mean pick it up, run with it, do something with it. And I think that's an important question.
Is there any value of comparing the local courier paper to say the Denver Post? Is there any value of that comparison between the two coverages? Because I at the time was in Eastern Colorado, and that's all my only source.
Right.
And like friends were telling me, but I tend to recall from the stories that I've read that some of the lesser things that were kind of put off by the Courier, your lesser values or whatever you call them, were more prevalent in those stories than they were.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly would be valuable to compare them. The reason why I didn't is because there were just so few stories, to look at, which would actually make my life a lot easier. But, in terms of comparability, you're usually looking for or quantitative comparability, you're usually looking for a much larger number. So, a different sort of analysis would probably be effective. But yeah. I also think that the Denver Post reprinted some of the Valley Courier stories. So I'm not even sure of the 20-odd stories that they printed, how many of them were original. I don't know the answer to that question either.
I remember in my head just we don't know the cause, and all this just kept on coming up.
Right. Well, and the Courier did that a lot too. They did repeatedly say, we don't know the cause, we may never know the cause. But that's as far as it went.
Well, there was I think a follow-up in the Post 1 year after the event, and it was a full-page, front-page story, went into the main section there, and there was a lot more interviews with citizens, it seemed to me, than there was with any of the Courier articles. The people that were still not getting recompense from the city. Rivera's Kitchen was one of them, I believe. And you didn't see that kind of negativity or non-positive kind of stuff in the Courier things. It's like a lot of it was just being washed over, or, we're not going to talk about this, it makes people upset. But the Denver Post, they went into a little bit more detail, but that was just that one article.
Right. It's really, is anybody from the Courier here? No? Okay. I was really, nervous about doing this. There's something about writing about people that you interact with that, that cautions you to a certain extent. If I have to see you every day, I'm probably not going to write about, what a cruddy job you did, for instance, And the Denver Post, 4.5 hours away, they don't ever have to see, Mayor Burvig or Don Coscolin. They can write about them with impunity, without having to look those guys in the face every day, where a Valley Courier reporter does.
Well, how much of that is because it's a small town? If it happened in Denver, would the Denver Post journalists be open and honest?
Yes, because the Denver Post is a much larger news organization. They apply these news, news values more strictly, and the government expects that of them. Not only do the readers expect it of them, but Mayor is Hickenlooper still the mayor of Denver? Hickenlooper expects that when the Denver Post comes to talk to him, they're going to ask hard questions. He's not going to get away with stuff.
It's not expected here.
I don't know. Quarantelli says no. And the coverage that we saw suggests no as well. Yeah.
Again, I'm having a hard time figuring out what the solution is. Because if you're a beat reporter in a small community and you offend the people that are your beat,
you're done. Yeah. I'm a scholar. We don't look at solutions. We analyze. No, I think that the solution, if we had to come up with a solution, would be a long-term solution wherein the Courier begins to implement more stringently these news values and slowly starts to ratchet up its adherence to them. And then eventually we'll get to a point where Mayor Burvig or whoever, because there's an election coming up, right, won't have this expectation, or that there won't be this relational conflict between the journalist and the source as to how things are going to be covered.
Can a college paper get away with?
Well, a college paper can get away with a lot of stuff. And it's for precisely the opposite reason. College students are supposed to be learning about all of these things, and as we know sometimes, college students aren't always the most tactful people in the world. right? So whereas a major news organization is able to be tougher because you expect it of them, a college newspaper is able to be tougher if they are able to do that, because there's no expectation that they're going to have this relationship with the local government. Furthermore, college students are generally only around for 4 years. So even if they piss a bunch of people off, after 4 years they're out of there, and you've got a whole new staff and a whole new relationship to set up. Yeah?
Do you really think they don't know?
Who they?
The city?
Oh, what happened?
I said, do they really?
I don't have any basis to make that kind of a judgment. I can't believe that they don't know, but I don't have any evidence to suggest that they do, and I also don't think that they would deliberately lie to us like that. So I don't know how to answer that question. Yeah.
There were things going on with the new water treatment plant was making changes so that all
Right.
the pipes would come into one source, and I think somehow that's part of what happened.
It's entirely possible. But one of the jobs of the media is to look into this stuff, to investigate claims. Before most of you guys came in, I was talking to Jen, and she was talking about, these rumors that were circulating at the time. There were tons of rumors out there, and I would have expected the Courier or any news organization to look into them, to disprove them, if nothing else. But you didn't see a whole lot of that either in the coverage. And it's possible that they did it and just didn't report on it because there was nothing to tell. But, that there's nothing to tell, I would think would be a story too.
So you're still a subscriber to this news source?
Uh-huh. I'm actually not.
Oh.
Sorry. But the school is, yeah, I do read the Courier.
Right, but I mean, it makes, if this is the story they tell about, if this is the quality of work that they did with an important story in our community, how do you evaluate their reporting, and why is it of value, and what do we get out of a news source that?
Well, like I said, the difference in how things are covered when they're extraordinary events versus regular day-to-day news operations is totally different, And I haven't done any research into their day-to-day operations, but I would like to believe that they, that. Plus, I also believe, journalists don't, journalists do this job because they love it, because they can't not do it, right? And so, and in doing that, they do the best damn job that they can. And news organizations also do the best damn job that they can. And so, I have faith that this news organization and other news organizations try hard, and even when they don't, I don't think that what I observed here in the salmonella crisis is unique to the Valley Courier. I think that if we looked at other small community papers in similar situations, we're going to come up with the same or similar data. Yes?
You spoke to the fact that a small paper may have limitations in terms of number of staff that can do in-depth coverage. Do they also have practical space limitations compared to a larger paper? If you've got 16 pages, are there certain things you can't do, or certain things that you maybe can't print? You may have done an investigation, a series of interviews, but you're quite limited in space because all these other things have to go on the front page of the paper. And
yeah, absolutely. However, I would think that something of this magnitude during this crisis would have, the Courier would have been able to find a news hole for it, or a place in the paper for this kind of information. I mean, even a story that says that the rumors aren't true, in and of itself, I think, is a significant enough story that something, the Dear Abby could have been pushed off for a day or something, Maybe not Dear Abby, but editors and publishers have to make decisions about what gets covered and what doesn't get covered. Every newspaper has to deal with that, and smaller newspapers have less room to play with. But it seems to me that that this crisis in this community would have taken precedence over other stories.
do small papers use their websites to present larger coverage or more expensive articles?
Some of them do.
Fit in?
I haven't done any, what's the word, any real analysis of the Valley Courier's website, but my cursory analysis is that it basically puts the same stories up on the website. I don't think that I've ever seen any additional depth or additional stories on the website that hasn't been in the paper. It may be there, but I haven't come across it. And I do look at their website pretty regularly.
Well, if there's no other questions, let's thank our speaker one more time.